I'd like to start now with the first part on basics of data protection and personal data and as well as sensitive data. So let's start with the definition. What is personal data according to the GDPR? The legal definition of personal data is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person called data subject. So this means that GDPR only applies to a living natural person. So if you work with data related to deceased data subjects, GDPR doesn't apply anymore. As well as GDPR also does not apply to other kind of data, for instance, corporate data. Anonymous or anonymized data is not considered personal data anymore. So if your data is anonymized in a way that it is really not possible to link the data anymore to, and if this identification is not possible anymore, then data is counted as anonymous and GDPR does not apply anymore. What is not personal data according to the GDPR may still be protected by other kinds of legislation. So there may be other reasons to protect this kind of data, for instance, ethical reasons or contractual reasons, copyright law, for instance. So even though GDPR may not apply to your data, there may be other legislation that applies. Sensitive data or special categories of personal data, according to the GDPR, comprises information that poses a risk to fundamental rights and freedoms. Listed examples in the GDPR are data related to the ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or ideological beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data, and any data concerning the sex life or sexual orientation of a natural person. So I've used the term identifiers before. So the GDPR distinguishes between direct identifiers and indirect identifiers. Direct identifiers refer to any information that directly and unambiguously identifies a person. Such information could be your name, your email address, a unique identification number like a student ID, a social security number, the advertisement ID on your phone, your IP address, etc. So this information directly identifies you and there is no ambiguity related to that. On the other hand, there is indirect information, which may not lead to your identification at once. So such information could be one or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of a natural person. So mainly any kind of social demographic information, gender, age, profession, place of residence, etc. The tricky part here is that this piece of information individually may not lead to your identification, but if this information is combined, you may be identified or identifiable. If you would like to try it out yourself, there is a link here on the slide where you are asked several questions regarding your gender, your birth date, your location, and so on and so forth. And if you try it out yourself, you can figure out that you will be identifiable pretty soon, especially if your birth date or precise birth date is in there. So you may already know up to now that, or it may have dawned on you that this information that is covered by GDPR is pretty essential in social sciences. So all this information on socio-demographic variables are standard variables in survey research. And since social sciences are the sciences about natural persons, all this information is an essential part of our research field. So researchers often now face this dilemma of, at the one hand, they are obliged by law to protect personal data and protect this information as much as possible. But on the other hand, research funding agencies, journals, and research ethics more and more push in the direction or enforce more and more requirements towards open science and require researchers to make data openly accessible, as openly as possible. So in the beginning of this open science movement, the requirement was to make data, or the idea was to make data openly accessible to everyone under the slogan of open data. Now, these two aspects, they don't do together. So how can researchers nevertheless fulfill both requirements? And this will be the focus of this webinar and the further aspects that we will cover here today. So the solution is to work with the framework of fair data. So in the beginning, as I told you before on the previous slide, the requirement or the idea was to make data available openly to everyone. Then the realization surfaced that this will not work for different sorts of reasons, because there are very good reasons to protect data and do not make data openly accessible and available for everyone and free to reuse it for everyone. So this idea of fair data covers or follows the slogan that data should be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary, because data protection is one of the reasons why data cannot be shared openly. So what does fair mean? Fair means findable. Data should be findable. So for instance, be connected to a DOIs and be listed in metadata catalog so that it can be found by other researchers who are interested in this data. Data should be accessible. This does not mean that data has to be openly accessible for everyone, but the rules under which data are accessible have to be clearly outlined, and these rules have to be openly available for everyone interested in the data. Data have to be interoperable, which means that different researchers should be able to use the data with different tools, and data should be reusable. So one important aspect here is that a clear license is attached to data. This was just a very, very brief introduction to what fair data means. If you're interested in this topic, you find a link to further presentations in another webinar that we did on this matter in the end of this slides. So now the solution, how to work with personal data and at the same time to comply to open science requirements, is to make your data fair. So what else to consider? So here's some basic guidelines. The GDPR is valid in all EU member countries, so all member states of the European Union and beyond. Still, there may be additional national legislation on data protection that may apply to your data, and this national legislation, since it's national, may differ across Europe. And so you may have to dig into your national legislation to find out more on this matter. Institutional regulations concerning data protection and legal basis for processing personal data may differ. So many institutions and universities and other research performing institutions have adopted policies on research data management, and the regulations in there may require you to save or delete data for a different amount of time, a different number of years. And also there are different ways of how to pay, different ways in consent forms, for instance, or different options how you can efficient option B is your legal basis of under which you process your personal data. Lisa will go into detail here later on, and your institutional data protection data protection officer may have different preferences here. These are just different approaches with different advantages and disadvantages, and institutions may have different preferences. Context matters. So even if you're familiar with data protection regulations and how to handle them in an open science framework, and even if you have experience in this matter from previous subjects, from previous projects, it's still a good idea to look into these regulations again before you start a new project, because even if these projects just differ in small aspects, you may not be able to apply the framework exactly on a new project. Also, this legal field is still evolving. There may be new regulations. For instance, your new institution may adopt new policies. So it's a good idea to check again before you start a project. And additional legislation and regulations may also be relevant for your project. So in addition to data protection regulations, you may also have to comply to other kinds of legislation or regulations, such as contractual obligations, copyright, or ethical matters. So for instance, if you work with social media data, you have to carefully read the terms of use that come along with this social media data. Or if you reuse any kind of data, you may be restricted by the attached license that comes with this data. So there's many rules and regulations and guidelines to follow where to find support. So most importantly, every institution has to have a data protection officer. So this is the most important contact point for any questions on data protection. Additionally, support may be available at your institution. So for instance, the legal department may answer questions related to legal questions and data protection questions, or maybe there is a special office dedicated to data protection regulation at your institution. Maybe there are data stewards employed at your institutions who have experience with working with personal data, or maybe there is a team working on research data management at your institution who is familiar with this topic and can offer you some guidance. Also, some infrastructures dedicated to research data management may offer support. So some repositories may offer support regarding data protection, especially if it comes to data that will be published at the repository. So repositories also have a legal basis to publish data, and their preferences may differ and the legal basis may differ. So it's a good idea to reach out to your repositories before you even start the data gathering process, so that you can confirm with them that the approach you choose in your informed consent, for instance, is compatible to their legal basis. And there is a lot of training materials online in the CESSDA training catalog. Okay, now I've reached the end of the first part. Are there any questions on the basics of data protection and personal and/or sensitive data? If not, I will hand over to Lisa and the second part.
So I will give you an overview over how to make personal or sensitive data fair. So now you've heard about what fair means and what personal sensitive data in general is. And we will now go through the different aspects of anonymization and consent forms, access restrictions, and licenses. So when we talk about data protection in a research project, we always think about the phase during the research project and after the research project. And these two tracks run parallel and have to be thought about in parallel. So during the research project, it is important that you have the necessary rights to store the personal or sensitive data also in a long-term way. that can be obtained through informed consent. And it is also important to think about the environment in which you store the data during the research project. And it is important to think about who has access to that data as well. Who in the research project, are there specific people who have more or less access rights, who work with personal non-anonymized data and who then work with anonymized data? And if there are any other protection measures in place, for example, if the data is encrypted. And once you move to the question of after the research project, the question is how to make the personal data fair. So here it is important to think about having the rights and the legal basis for publishing and archiving the data as well, because that is what happens after the research project, and to protect people's privacy when publishing this data. And this can be done through several mitigation measures. And I've put 3 on here. So the first question is how to present information in an appropriate way, for example, by anonymizing data. The second tool is to implement access control, for example, through restricting access. And the third option is to clarify and potentially restrict reuse options through licenses. So these are the three measures that you can use in order to make data fair and then to publish data that contains or has contained personal sensitive data. And I will walk you through these 3 different options now. And they're not mutually exclusive, so they can all happen at the same time and actually should happen at the same time. So first, let's dive into anonymization. Anonymization in general is the process of altering information in a way that people cannot be identified due to that information anymore. So that's the basic idea. And as Anita said before, collecting information on individuals is a crucial step in social science research. However, if you want to publish that data, you have to anonymize the data. So the best solution in general is to not collect identifying information if it is not absolutely necessary, because ultimately you would need to delete it again. So making your life easier is a very fruitful idea here. So do not collect any identifying information that you do not actually need. The second best solution then is to edit the information to exclude potentially identification in the data. That is the process of anonymization. And here there's 2 different aspects. So Anita mentioned direct and indirect identifiers before. With direct identifiers, best practice is to just remove them entirely. So that applies to names, phone numbers, social security numbers, email addresses, IP addresses, and so on. Those should just be removed completely. And with indirect identifiers, as you heard before, those do not render a person directly identifiable, but the combination of certain sociodemographic variables makes people, allows respondents to be identified. So the way to go with indirect identifiers is to, well, either remove them if you do not need the information, replace them with similar characteristics, or aggregating indirect identifiers. For example, if you think about income, a lot of times in surveys, the response would actually not be the exact household income, but income in brackets. So the general takeaway from this is, if the personal data is not needed, please delete it and or do not collect it beforehand. And if you keep it, you have to have a good reason for that. So obviously the next question is, but how do you decide what to anonymize? And here there's 2 aspects to keep in mind. So first of all, there's the identification risk. And second of all, there's potential harm. So both of these speak to the question of what actually happens to a respondent, or what would happen to a respondent if they were to be identified in a data set. So identification risk can be assessed by asking how high the identification risk is, how that can be reduced, and what acceptable information loss is. As I said before about the income brackets, is the information loss that you have to suffer from not knowing the exact household income, but knowing a general bracket. Is that something that makes your research still work? That is something you have to think about. And assessing potential harm is speaks to the consequences of the identification for a respondent. So how harmful would it be for a respondent to be identified? Is there any material in the data that could cause actual harm to the respondent? And that largely depends on your research question. If you work with minority groups, that's something to think about. If you work with vulnerable subjects, if you work with within the health sector or health part of social sciences, these are two measures to think about. And ultimately, what many of you now may think about, but when are data actually anonymous? And this is a very context-dependent question to answer. And there is no clearly defined point at which research data is fully anonymized. In some fields and in some legal fields, the terminology of factual anonymization is used as an imposition to complete anonymization or absolute anonymization, where the anonymization could theoretically be possible, but it would require unreasonable efforts in terms of time or cost or labor. So that is also something that you might come across when you talk to your data protection officer or different RDM staff. So something that you can think about is if maybe there is other information available outside of your data set that could render your respondents available, whether there is any kind of additional knowledge, maybe if there's potentially future developments that have to be taken into account. And now I have a quick thought exercise for you. So here's two examples of a professor. And I want you to briefly think about these characteristics and then think about which one of these is more anonymous than the other, or which one of these is anonymous. And I will quickly write in the chat, and then you can do a thumbs up as a reaction to that chat message. That's the easiest way. Usually we do this verbally with smaller groups, but we're 72 people right now. So that's going to be a bit hard. So yeah, read the examples really quickly. Okay, we already have some answers. Okay, so you saw that the difference in these two examples is the discipline. And in example B, the discipline that was classical archaeology in example A is recoded to a broader discipline, to social sciences in example B. And that at least aggregates some information. And as you also said, it also depends on the size of the sample. So if there is only one female professor at the University of Vienna in archaeology in the given age bracket, the discipline classical archaeology is going to be the characteristic that makes that person very likely, very quickly identifiable. And the assumption would be that the broader category of social sciences would make the universe of potential respondents bigger. But that is something that would need to be checked. And maybe the classical archaeology department has 60 full professors, half of which are female. So this is where context really matters. So you also have to know your data well and know your research question well in order to decide how to anonymize your data. When you go a bit deeper into the anonymization theory, you will also come across the word or the terminology anonymization versus pseudonymization. And that is a kind of a gradual distinction. So when we talk about, again, just as a reminder, when we talk about personal data that is non-pseudonymized or non-anonymized, that is data containing identifiers. And pseudonymized data is data that does not contain any direct and indirect identifiers, but there is a key that allows to reverse that process. And that is still considered personal data. So the GDPR still applies to that type of data. However, anonymized data, then data without the direct and indirect identifiers and without a key, where no re-identification is possible, that is not considered personal data. So that is something to keep in mind and be aware of, depending on which terminology your institution also uses. That brings us to the next big topic, how to make your data fair. That is consent. So consent is one of the possible legal bases for processing personal data. And some institutions rely a lot on informed consent. Other institutions rely on the exceptions for public interest and research interests. And that is something that you need to check with your institution. However, if you base the processing of personal data on consent, according to Article 6 of the GDPR, you need a consent form. And that consent form is going to be specific to your project. There are consent form wizards and sort of text suggestions that you can use, but it's really important to really adapt these consent forms to your project, because your respondents will consent to taking part in your specific project. So it's also important that they are informed about that. And especially when you want to archive and publish and make your data available for reuse, it is important to also add the information about the archiving and reuse steps in the consent form. Otherwise, you might not be able to actually archive your data. And there's some practicalities with consent. So first of all, you need to get active and voluntary consent that is based on comprehensive and easily understandable information. That means that you might need to alter and adapt your consent forms depending on your target group. There's a difference whether you do research with children or with legal experts. So it depends on the group. And in general, consent can be withdrawn. So you also should think about how to deal with the withdrawal of consent. So if someone withdraws their consent after you have finished data collection and withdraws their consent to have their data processed, you are obliged to actually remove the information of that person from your data set. If that withdrawal only happens after you have already anonymized the data, it really depends. You might not be able to identify the person anymore, because that is the entire idea behind anonymization. And especially if you do a large quantitative survey with 2,000 participants, you have no chance of finding that person again. But if you are doing qualitative research and do 5, 6 in-depth interviews with people, even if you have anonymized that interview or the content of that interview, because you spend so much time with your respondents, you might still be able to know who said what. So then there's a kind of a moral obligation to remove that data. Some recommendations point out that you can also try to obtain granular consent so that respondents can opt in to different or consent to different ways of processing data. So some want to consent to having their data processed and analyzed, but not published, for example. That is an idea of, or that can be manageable. As a sort of a practical piece of advice, I would just make sure that these processes are actually manageable so that it doesn't get too granular, because otherwise you will be overwhelmed with managing 10 different layers and tiers of consent, which would not be beneficial to your research either. And on this slide and the next slide, I've just put some examples of statements on how to obtain consent. These, for example, are not recommended, mostly because they promise or they put unnecessary restrictions on you. For example, the last one says the anonymized data will only be used in the research project and will not be shared with third parties. And that directly counters the idea of fair data, sharing data as openly as possible, but as closed as necessary, which would put an unnecessary restriction on you as a researcher. And here the recommended examples are sort of less blanket terms, but more clear what is going to happen to data at which point. And you also see that obviously these get a bit longer because there is a bit more explanation. But if you concretely need help with how to form consent forms, the consent form wizard from Daria is linked on the slides. And that is generally something that your institution's data protection officer will have a lot of experience with as well. And when you have consent and process personal data, this is a very useful checklist to use as well. So these are also questions that you might need to answer if you're writing a data management plan, actually. So who has access to which kind of data is important during the project and after the project, as I said before. When in the process or when in the research project are data actually anonymized? Who is responsible for these measures? And where are the identifiers kept? If they are kept, is an identification key. And what is interesting here is that there are no general deadlines according to the GDPR. So there is no deadline that says you need to delete identifiers after X amount of time. But the general principle is that personal sensitive data should be deleted when it is no longer needed. So in general, sort of thinking about these issues and arguing for them and being aware of them is really helpful. Which brings us to the third bullet point on how to make data fair and how to make the sharing of personal sensitive data possible, which is through different access options. So access restrictions directly relate to the open science slogan of as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And fair data prescribes that the access regulations to data are clearly described and understandable and reasonable. And if there are access restrictions, there's two important questions. So first of all, who decides upon access? So who decides who has access to which type of data? And then who decides upon access in the long term as well? So who decides during the research project and then again after the research project? And especially after the research project, this is something that research data repositories will help you with. And that is also their task to provide different access options and manage them as well. And in general, there's sort of less restrictive, more restrictive access option. And I will briefly describe how we do this at the Austrian Social Science Data Archive, so you have a sort of a better hands-on understanding of what different access options actually are. So the most open version is the open access option, which means that datasets are available to interested parties without any restrictions. There's no login required. There's no account required. There's no institutional backing from a university required. These datasets are accessible openly and are licensed under a CC BY license as well. And then we have two different options for a more restricted access, one that is called restricted account-based access, and the other one is called restricted controlled access. For both of these, an account in our repository software is needed. And for the restricted account-based access, as the term already says, as soon as there is an account, access is granted after the users are accepting the terms of use and terms of access. And that is the most frequently used access form we provide. And is usually, I guess there's the reuse there is tailored especially to scientific reuse. And then the third option is the restricted controlled access that works as the restricted account-based access in the sense that you need an account to be able to log in and accept the terms of use and terms of access. But then we also require users to describe their research interest in a form and send it to us. And the repository staff then decides upon access. So that this is an additional safeguarding measure where we also can make sure that we are able to share data sets that contain a bit more personal information than others probably. So these are the sort of the practical implication of how these different access options look like. And I already mentioned licenses before. So licenses are the third way of managing how to share data. So there are appropriate licenses depending on the identification risk or the potential harm to respondents. And I already mentioned scientific use or scientific reuse. That would be governed under a tailored license for exactly that scientific use. And these are often more appropriate for personal and sensitive data because they narrow the reuse options down a little bit more. Open access licenses, however, such as Creative Commons licenses, most commonly CC BY licenses. So name attribution is required, but otherwise reusers are free to remix, redistribute, build upon existing work. These are usually not suited for personal or sensitive data. And that is also something that you might come across in templates for data management plans. So sometimes it is stated that you need to specify under which open license you're sharing your data. And if you're not sharing it under an open data, you need to say why. So that could be a reason for that, for example. And again, these different licenses are that's one task that a research data repository will help you with and will help you decide upon.
So let's start with general rules and guidelines. This slide is more or less a sum up of what you've heard in the previous parts. How to anonymize your data. So first thing to think about is, are there any direct identifiers in your data? And if there are, before publication, the thing to do is removing them, usually. Then the second thing to ask yourself is which indirect identifiers are in your data, and what information do they reveal if they are combined. And the second thing is that I will talk today is that there are different measures for anonymization available. So I will go into detail in the next slide. There are different measures for anonymization available for quantitative data and also for qualitative data. And there are also some tools available that are intended to support researchers in this anonymization task. In general, unfortunately, there is no recipe or no one-fits-all solution. So context always matters, and the precise framework of your project matters. So risk of re-identification needs to be assessed in relation to the population, and the consequences of re-identification have to be considered. This is the potential harm. So if you have a study covering your national MPs, the risk of re-identification likely is very high, for instance, because there's a lot of information available on members of parliament. On the other hand, depending on the information you collect of these MPs, the potential harm may be very small if you, for instance, just collect general information on their or political views, because this is no secret of a political actor and of an MP. So here you have to weigh these two aspects. On the other hand, if you have a very large population, like for example, the entire population of a country, but if this information is revealed or political views are revealed, and this may cause a lot of harm to an individual because, for instance, this person lives in a country where liberal rights and human rights are not protected, and they could end up in prison or worse for expressing their political views, then this potential harm is, of course, very large. And even though the reidentification risk may be small, nevertheless, you may need to undertake a lot of measures and precautions to share this kind of data. And also, as Lisa also said before, different research questions may require different levels of acceptable information loss. And for instance, if you really need very detailed information on one aspect of your data, for instance, if you really need very detailed information, geographical information, you may be able to use other tools to nevertheless share your data. You maybe, for instance, can aggregate other information to a higher level that are not as crucial to your research question, or maybe you can work with access restriction and the restricting the reuse via licenses. So how does this work for quantitative data? First thing, as I've mentioned before, remove all direct identifiers like the birthday, social security number, email addresses, etc. Then researchers have to identify all variables that are potentially indirect identifiers. Basically, all variables describing respondents or demographic information, and also all variables containing open text. Because if you have survey data, for instance, and an online survey, you may know you may know the categories that respondents were given in closed questions by heart, but you don't know what they put in open text questions. So if you ask for what is the most important topic for you in the upcoming election, someone may go into detail and, for instance, include information such as improve the economic situation in my constituency, which is da 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 da. So you don't know what information respondents add in here, so you have to go over through this information, because sometimes respondents even add their contact information in open text questions. Next thing is to consider potential factors that may increase the re-identification risk, for instance, the combination of variables and values that are sparse in the population. So certain occupation groups, ethnic minorities, first language, outliers for age, monthly income, and household sizes. For instance, first language spoken at home, or also country of birth of parents, may be very general. So if I take Austria as an example, in the general population there are many persons who have parents, for instance, born in Germany or in other neighboring countries. But if you have the information in there, for instance, as one respondent indicates that their mother was born in Ireland and the father in Iceland, then it becomes this information, or this combination may be very unique, and you need to ask yourself whether this information significantly increase the re-identification risk. And there also may be the option of other information available. So depending on the kind of data you work with, if there is, for instance, directly identifying information, there may be other data sources available that you could combine with your data, that could be merged with your data, which would then greatly increase the re-identification risk of your respondents or of your data subjects. So how to anonymize quantitative data? There are different approaches. One approach is aggregation. So if you have categorical variables, you could aggregate them to broader categories. So for instance, aggregating municipalities to districts, or aggregating groups of occupations to higher or broader groups. If you have discrete variables, you could recode them to categorical variables. So for instance, if you have the precise age of respondents, you could recode this information to age groups. Another technique is called Winsorization. This is basically top and bottom coding, so aggregating outliers. So for instance, if you have informations in your data of respondents or of data subjects that are above a certain age, where above 90 years old, for instance, you could recode them to 90 or above. Depends on the demographic of your population. Another technique is called deletion or cell suppression, which is basically deleting entire variables, so direct identifiers like names and email addresses, and or also deleting individual values if just individual values of a specific data subjects could increase this reunification risk. For instance, coming back to this example with mother from Ireland, father from Iceland, living in Austria, if you decide to remove this kind of information, you could just delete this individual values and set them to other country, or to no response, or just missing. Then there is a technique called randomization. So you could randomize the values based on probabilities, for instance, and or also based on how frequently these values are available in the general population. And yeah, for more measures, there is a paper linked in here. So in this paper, these measures are described and also others. How to perform anonymization in qualitative data. So the first thing is to discuss the when will the data be anonymized, how and by whom. The reason is because data in qualitative research designs so anonymization in qualitative research design often requires going over the entire material, which could be, depending on the size of the project, more effort than in quantitative research. So it's a good idea to start in the beginning and to lay out a plan already in the beginning so that you have set rules and can apply these rules over the entire research projects and avoid going over the material over and over again. First thing is, if you work with text data, for instance, is read interview transcripts carefully, get a feeling for your data, see which information maybe needs to be anonymized. Then you have to find direct identifiers and define rules for yourself how you anonymize this information. So one approach would be to replace this information with general terms. So to replace Jane Doe with the term name in square brackets, for instance, and the precise company name with a big company in square brackets, or the information University of Vienna with the information at a large university, or a university with more than, I don't know, 50,000 students. It's important to write down these rules. There are also other possible ways. You could replace names with similar names. So transform a Stephen to a Mark, for instance. But it's important to write these rules down. There's also an example linked here where you could find an example how of this anonymization guide could look like. To give some best practice examples from our project. So here you find a link to the European Value Study, data from Austria from 1990 to 2018, and this data set is archived at AUSTA. So how did anonymization process, how was the anonymization process like in this case? So the staff, both at the project and at the repository, checked all variables manually, keeping these two questions in mind: how high is the identification risk given the population, and what are the potential consequences or the potential harm? And then several anonymization measures were applied that were described in the methods report in detail. So you also find the method reports under the DOI, and then you can see how each individual variable was recoded in order to comply to data protection regulations. So one example is the aggregation to product categories, for instance, religious denomination, the size of town, the educational level, the occupation. So the occupation, for instance, ISCO level 3 and 4 were dropped, and it only ISCO level 2 was kept and recoded to ISCO level 1 in certain instances. For instance, ISCO categories cover many individual occupation groups, of course, and for some occupations groups that are very sparse in the population, in the case of Austria, it's, for instance, the military, then even ISCO level 2 may lead to the identification of someone in combination with other characteristics that you know about this person. And the geographic location was also aggregated, for instance, the country of birth. So, for instance, you could aggregate the country of birth to continents if appropriate. Windsorization was also applied. So, for instance, the year of birth was recoded to 1935 and before for elderly respondents. And as I said before, everything is described in a methods report, so you could have a look on there. What's not on the slide, but this data set is available under restricted account-based access. So access is also one aspect that is incorporated here as an additional data protection measure, and the license is scientific use. So this license is also tailored to the requirements of data collected in a social science community. A second example is the European Social Survey, or ESS. So here the lawful basis for collecting the data and processing the data is public interest. This is one option of collecting the data, and the European Social Survey does not collect or does not offer respondents' consent forms. They work with the legal basis of public interest. This means that respondents do not receive a consent form, but they receive an information sheet with all their rights outlined there. And then the managing of the disclosure risk remains under the responsibilities of the national teams, which means that the national research groups are responsible for anonymizing the data up to a level that they say, okay, now we have reached a level of anonymization that the re-identification risk is very, very small. And before they submit the data to the European Social Survey, they confirm that they have undertaken these measurements. There is a project-wide anonymization guide, which includes, for instance, guidelines how to handle this anonymization. So also the ESS is aware of the fact that there is no recipe, so they do not give concrete checklists of what to do, but they lay out some guidelines. One of these guidelines is remove all direct identifiers. Another guideline is that they of course outline that the risk of re-identification has to be minimized, and as support to achieve this goal, they offer a list of variables that potentially contain identifying information. In this project-wide anonymization guide, there is also a list of measures described how the re-identification risk can be reduced, which is basically a description of how data can be aggregated or how researchers can apply windsorization to achieve this anonymization goal. And in this project-wide anonymization guide, it's also made clear that the baseline for assessing the re-identification risk is the entire population and not the sample at hand, but again, the entire population. And the European Social Survey also offers trainings and webinars for project members to get all these national teams to a level where they can handle their anonymization guides, where they can apply these guidelines on their own. The last example is the Generations and Gender program. So here the lawful basis for this survey program is the informed consent. Of course, the Generations and Gender program, or GGP, also anonymizes data. So first of all direct identifiers are removed. And then, since this program works with important life events of respondents, they add some random noise to these time events by adding randomly between 0 and 3 months to the time elapsed since these events. They also aggregate information to regions, so they work with randomization, they work with aggregation, and they work with cell suppression or deletion. In addition, they have quite strict access regulations, so researchers who are interested in the data have to confirm or to agree to regulations that hinder any re-identification attempts. So they have to agree to these guidelines that they will not undertake any measures to try to re-identify respondents. There is also a teaching dataset available, which is open access, which contains less of these identifying information. So this is also one option researchers have, which is also offered at the Austrian Social Science Data Archive. So the idea is here to publish multiple datasets, a detailed dataset which contains more granular data and which is better suited for scientific research, and then other datasets that are higher aggregated, where more anonymization measures have been applied, which result in more information loss, but on the other hand can be shared more openly. And for certain demographic groups or occupations, these data sets or the information transmitted in these data sets is plenty. So for instance, journalists or students in method courses can work fine with this kind of information. So here the access restrictions do not have to be as severe or as restrictive as for the more granular data tailored for scientific use. So as I've already foreshadowed before, there are tools available for anonymization. I would like to briefly describe two today here. Our first tool is Amnesia, which is offered and operated by OpenAir. Amnesia is a software that can be downloaded and then is installed and runs locally on your computer. It is based on Java and JavaScript. It works exclusively for delimited text files. So if you work with other kind of data, you need to first transform it to these formats. How does Amnesia work? Basically by aggregation. So you have to define a hierarchy of values yourself. You have to manually. There are for some variables, there is already a scheme online, but basically you have to define your hierarchies yourself, like for instance, countries to broader geographic regions and so on and so forth. And then the software assists you by anonymizing your data automatically according to a threshold that you have defined before. So how many observations you would like to have per combinations of indirect identifiers. There's another called SDC Micro, Statistical Disclosure Control Methods for Anonymization of Data and Risk Estimation. This is an R package and has also a graphical interface. Here also it's the researcher's job to identify direct identifiers and also to identify indirect identifiers, which are called key variables in this framework. They have to be identified manually, and this information has to be transmitted to this package or has to be defined. Then the advantage of this package is that the disclosure risk and the information loss can be calculated by means of statistical values. So it provides more fun. Yeah, you can squeeze this information in numbers. Again, anonymization techniques have to be applied manually, so recoding, as far as I understood, has to be applied manually, which means you have to do the aggregation yourself, although this graphical interface of an SDC Micro helps and assists you with that, so you don't have to know R for recoding if you use the interface. Tools in a nutshell, what remains to be said here is that it always requires input by critical users. So in both cases, you have to identify the direct identifiers yourself. You also have to identify the indirect identifiers yourself. They are just tools that can assist you, but they don't shift the responsibility from the researchers to the computer. So it's just a support infrastructure, but it doesn't solve the issue of identifying this information and then identifying information. And also a side note here, at Auster, we do not use any of these tools. So what I've presented here today is just a brief overview. But since we do not use it ourselves, we cannot go into more detail here, and we also do not know all the information and the advantages and disadvantages these tools offer. So now I would like to open the general Q&A session.
Yes, so let's start with the first question. Should I read it again, maybe, and then you can decide who answers. Okay, so I am working at a panel infrastructure where we collect a range of socio demos that every researcher can use. We have a lot of data, but do not know beforehand what research questions they would like to answer. How would you handle such a situation?
This is the one question that is very familiar to many repositories, right? Because repositories publish data, often broad studies like the European Social Service or election studies, where many variables are in there. And the goal is to allow others to reuse the data, but you don't know exactly which research questions will come up and which research questions are most interesting for others. So unfortunately, the response here is it depends. So you have to find a reasonable balance between anonymization measures and information loss. What also helps me a little bit for quantitative data is if I know that the number of observation is very, very low, both in the population and in the sample, then it doesn't really offer any statistical leverage anyways. So higher aggregation would not really result in a lot of information loss. So Lisa, maybe you would like to add something, but basically I would say, depending on your data, you have to go through all these individual measurements that we've listed here. So think about which access mechanism is appropriate, think about which license is appropriate, and go through each variable and weigh the identification risk versus the potential harm and the information loss.
Yes, I would wholeheartedly agree to this. And I would also maybe add that obviously you don't know which exact research questions you're going to answer or other researchers are going to answer, and that largely influences how you're going to anonymize the specific variables. But in general, it's good to have some kind of idea about the research questions that are most likely going to pop up in order to prevent you from collecting information that you do not actually need. Because that is something you should pay attention to. So kind of just collecting the respondent's exact address without actually knowing that you're going to do that your research question is going to be related to that is probably a bit difficult. So striking that balance there. And then, as Anita said, going through the individual variables and kind of critically applying the general procedures.
Next question is about consent forms. So I have observed that in recent years, consent forms have become longer and more complicated. The purpose seems to be to inform and protect participants as well as safeguard researchers, to make sure they inform participants about everything. However, my experience is that the result is opposite. Participants tend to skip information and just provide their consent without reading it, which basically means that they remain uninformed despite our best intentions. What is your experience and guidance in this regard?
I would say I think that is that observation I think exists and observes the reality. My best answer there would be to kind of keep in mind what consent forms should be, that they should be easily understandable, provide the information that is necessary in language that the respondents also understand. So I think what you personally can do is to try avoid that your consent forms produce a situation where respondents just skip over because it's too much and just consent anyways because it doesn't matter. So kind of sticking to that rationale on how to easily and concisely explain what you're about to do with the data. Because obviously the sort of information overwhelm of respondents is a problem. And I mentioned before that you can work with granular consent and it has to be manageable for you, but at the same time, consent forms need to be manageable for your respondents. And as you rightfully say, if it's too much, they might just skip over and not actually understand what they're consenting to.
And maybe what I could add, maybe your data of the final say on consent forms usually has the data protection officer. So an idea that comes to my mind, but please check if this is an option, is that maybe you keep the consent form as small as possible. Of course, all the necessary information in there, but maybe there's information that you could move to a kind of appendix, like the information where to complain. So maybe you could outsource this somewhere to say, well, this is the most important aspects. Here we require your consent, and in more details, you can look it up on the second page or something like that. Maybe that works.
Okay, the next question is on what type of variables randomization can be used to anonymize the data?
Well, in the paper that is on the slides, they work with probabilistic estimates. They also work with microaggregation, or they don't work with that. They mentioned the microaggregation, which is basically you have the values form groups and then aggregate the values to the mean of this group, which could maybe also be considered aggregation. We know that some large programs work with randomization insofar as they work with census data, and when it comes to gender, this information or the categories for gender differ across countries. So some countries that offer the probabilities of having 3 categories, male, female, and non-binary, for instance, or diverse, or however the label of this category may be in detail. But then you run into the problem that in the population, this information is so sparse that this may lead to the re-identification of a person. And at the same time, if you know that it's census data, and if you know this census data contains these 3 categories, removing this information doesn't make any sense, because then this information, then you know basically that this removed information is this 3rd category. So in this case, the survey randomized these respondents to one of these categories and randomly assigned them gender of either male or female. Where else may randomization may apply? In the GGP, as I mentioned, in the survey, an important aspect is life events, and for these precise life events like when were you married, when did you graduate, for instance, they randomly add 0 to 3 months. So this introduces some kind of noise.
Thank you. And there is one question concerning the Ireland example. You said that the example with parents from Ireland and Iceland, the country cannot be deleted, but can also be replaced by another country. Wouldn't this be a kind of data falsification, or is it a pseudonymization?
What I probably mean, but replaced with, I hope I framed it that way or phrased it that way, replaced by other information, which means like you could aggregate it to Western European country, for instance, which would be then not wrong, but broad enough that it could be either Ireland or Iceland or Norwegian or Monaco or France or whatever. So that's what I meant, actually.
Exactly. And I would also like to add that you would all, in your research report or in your method report, you would also explicitly state that you have done anonymization procedures. So it's not as if you're going to cheat your reusers by presenting them with inaccurate data, but you are going to be transparent about your anonymization steps and what you did. And you're also going to be clear that you do that in order to protect your respondents. So it is transparent, but ultimately the identification risk is lowered. That's also, it's documented or it should be documented.
Mm-hmm. And there is this anonymization technique of substituting by synonyms, like for qualitative research, substitute or replacing McDonald's with Kentucky Fried Chicken or whatever. So, but as Lisa said, it's important to document it and also to use really synonyms or comparable institutes, which may be difficult for countries probably, maybe easier for other variables. But personally, I, for my part, would say that aggregation is an easier measure to apply here, because you don't need to argue why Ireland and Iceland are or are not comparable and could be synonyms or replaced by one another.
And I think there are no more questions in the chat, and we have reached 11:30. So again, thank you for your attendance, and a reminder to please fill out the feedback form that will appear to you once you close the meeting, and check out the Info for Next Gen homepage for more events. And thank you. And thanks a lot to Lisa and Anita for the great presentations.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you for all the good questions. It's great to have an interactive webinar again. That was great. Thanks.